Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. After a break of about a year, this is the 16th episode of the SIMM-podcast. In a few weeks, the yearly international symposium will be organized in Brisbane, Australia. Bridie Bartlett is in charge of organizing it. Bridie is the president of SIMM, and she is also professor and Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the Creative Arts Research Institute at Griffith University, where the upcoming symposium will be held from the 20th to the 22nd of November. We wanted to take this opportunity to tell you about a recent publication Bridie Bartlett has been involved in as co-editor, the Compendium of Music as a Global Resource. Bridie, you, together with Barbara Hesser, you edited the 5th edition of this impressive compendium, Music as a Global Resource. And I would like you to tell us how this project came into being and how it's set up, because it's quite an impressive group of music practice that is brought together, and this is already the 5th edition, so it's quite an impressive work.
Thank you, Lucas. It is an impressive work, and it's quite unique in that it gives us a global perspective in a way that other publications don't. So it was a great pleasure to join Barbara Hesser on the 5th edition, which we co-edited for the United Nations 75th anniversary. But as you point out, this is the 5th edition. Music as a global resource actually has a long history, and I'm delighted that you're going to be speaking with Barbara Hesser as well, because she's been involved from the very beginning. So Music as a Global Resource is actually a not-for-profit organisation based in New York City, and for the last 20 years or so has been involved in championing music as, first of all, it was a natural resource, and now it's described as a global resource for addressing some of the world's most pressing social, cultural, economic, educational and environmental issues. And for many years, Music as a Global Resource has organised high-level dialogues at the United Nations to put music on the agenda of social and cultural and economic development concerns at the UN. And part of its work has been producing a regular compendium that highlights, not in abstract or theoretical terms, but in very real, concrete terms, projects that are occurring across the world, addressing a raft of issues, but also progressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So this has been a huge undertaking, bringing all of these projects together and presenting them in a way that allows us to look at what kind of global picture we can get from looking at them alongside one another.
Barbara Hesser is professor at the New York University since 1974 and head of the music therapy training program there. She has also been president of the American Music Therapy Association, and working for the UN, she was asked to look at projects involving music educators, not only music therapists. Barbara Hesser is the person who has been editing the Compendium of Music as a Global Resource for the UN, of which a 5th edition is now out. It's an incredible resource on social and community music practice throughout our world, including 109 projects from 55 countries. The compendium can be found and read online, at musicasaglobalresource.org. My first question to Barbara is how they selected the projects to be included in this compendium.
The first edition, has developed into something much bigger. The concept is to have exemplar projects that show as many different uses of music as we can. Many of the projects around the world duplicate what has been done in other projects. They have the same goals, they have the same approach. And so we didn't want to have a lot of duplicates, which would maybe involve more countries. We wanted to just have exemplar projects so that people got the idea of what music could do for individuals and communities. And so that was the concept of gathering the projects. What I did in the first compendium is that I had a great deal of contact with my international colleagues. And I asked them to submit projects that they felt were exemplar, using music for issues that were important to their communities and their cultures. And so that's how I got the first set of exemplar projects and have been doing it the same way since then. So these projects are projects that are recommended by people that I trust their judgment on what a good project looks like. There was no template or requirements to get into the compendium in terms of what the project had to have, but it had to be seen as an effective project by experts.
Yes, and of course, you may not have imagined that there will be 5 editions of the compendium when you started.
I certainly didn't imagine. No.
But of course, having 5 editions of this compendium, that makes quite a compendium altogether.
It does. We would always consider re-including a project if they were still operating. And what I think is good news is that many of these projects have been sustainable since 2009 and have continued to build and grow their work. So I do think that indicates that the quality of the program is good and strong, that they've been able to sustain their involvement in the work. So many of the projects in this compendium are still the same ones from the original compendium. And there have been some that have not continued.
Yes.
And those have been eliminated from this edition of
Yes, and they can stop for different reasons, of course. Funding, but also maybe not corresponding to a need. But as you know, we're talking on the SIMM-podcast, and SIMM is all about research.
Yes.
I also see that in the compendium, in each presentation of a project, there's also some explanation about the research, which is research, also evaluation and monitoring, which is not really the same, but still, which is done on the project which is being presented. I have a question about this because, how to say it nicely, but practitioners do have the tendency to present their practice very beautifully, and maybe so their narrative about their practice is not necessarily corresponding exactly to the reality it represents, let's say. That is also the reason, I think, why it is necessary to be able to develop serious research on the different sorts of practices in this field. How do you go about this as an editor of such a compendium to get a feeling of whether a presentation of a project is near the reality of its project or not so real, not so near the reality of the project? Yes.
Exactly. I had to go on a hope that the people who were proposing these projects knew that it was sustainable, that it was a good project, that it was seen for, doing what it said it could do. But you can't prove it, I guess the question is that most of the projects would love to have research being done. But the creative pioneers who started these programs don't often have the expertise to do research and would love to be given research or, having people brought in to consult with them on research. And that was a possible goal for MAGR, but you need money for that.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, research isn't, most people don't give away free research. It's a job that requires time and energy and experience. And so we knew that this was a commitment that would cost a lot of money if you send researchers to these projects. So there's no question in my mind that research and program evaluation research as well could be very useful to these projects, particularly for fundraising.
And also wished by the projects?
Yes, very much so.
Yes.
In fact, they asked for it. You know, when asked how we could help these projects, their biggest concern was funding. You know, I think they felt very comfortable about the creative ideas that they were implementing. They didn't need much guidance in that area, but they did need guidance in research because they would say that they didn't have the resources to do it and hadn't found anyone to collaborate with them on it. So that, to me, is the big divide, you know, between research and the projects. I think they would love to have it. You know, many that I spoke to, but just don't have the access to anyone.
Yes.
And so we get a lot of calls at MAGR about, could you send us reference lists of research on our topic? You know, they want to know what the research is that they don't even have access to themselves. So, and this is something that we don't have to provide, you know, so that would be very useful. You know, some kind of a research listing on the different topics that people are addressing, the different areas of need and the different, you know, problem areas they're addressing. But we can't send that to them because we haven't grown big enough yet to have those lists made.
I would like to ask you something about the need that you encounter that is expressed by the people in this practice, in this very broad field of practice, musical practice, the need for training and accompaniment of practitioners, be it musicians or social community workers.
Yes, I mean, having spent my whole career in music therapy, I mean, music therapy is a field, a profession that's very conscientious about training, certification, being able to be trained, and to do this, if you're going to be working with people in need, to have this kind of training. And so I'm coming from that mindset. Different countries, developing countries, they have different needs. Music therapy is in many of the countries where these projects are taking place. I've had project directors seek me out to ask me what are some of the concepts that they can bring into their program in the area. So they're aware that you know, perhaps a training would be helpful. But you know, to my knowledge, I don't know where there are these trainings. Projects themselves have started trainings.
On the job training, yes.
And that is helpful. I mean, to get some kind of, and have written it into their purpose, you know, it's to train the new people that come and how to do this work. You know, so they're successful, they're communicating to the new people coming up. I know that music education in some universities, such as New York University, now has courses in music and special education. And they are taken by music educators who are now more and more seeing that they need to work with special needs children. And so one or two courses isn't enough for a training, but it's a beginning. Acknowledgement that it's necessary. Special education teachers are taking those courses as well, to learn how to use music with the kids that they're working with. I've been thinking about it ever since I knew that this was one of the questions you were interested in, and I don't have the solution of how to do the training. Certainly I'm very interested in it because I think it would be very necessary. I've heard examples that trouble me, about people working, for example, in songwriting, really well-intentioned musicians who are doing songwriting with very troubled children, people who have experienced a lot of trauma. And the people that they're working with are really expressing themselves and their hurt and their pain, and the musicians don't know what to do with it. And I think music can be very helpful, and writing a song can be very impactful to the person doing it, but it can also be harmful. And I don't know that many of these people really considered the harm that they could be doing to have people going through their trauma again in a song, and the re-traumatization that can create. And I think that that's just a lack of training of how do you work with people that are traumatized, for example. And so many of the people that we work with in our world these days are traumatized. Poverty, war, serious illness. There's a lot of very difficult things that we work with as musicians, and I think it would be very helpful to have training.
And helpful to be able to work in teams with psychologists, social workers, community workers who were...
One of our very early projects that was a woman who played in a symphony orchestra, and she was helping her musicians come into hospitals to play for people. And she realized very quickly that this was not a good idea without training. And so she developed a training program for anybody who wanted to do this work.
Specifically for this.
And suggestions of how to work with, say, the music therapist on staff, and how to collaborate with the proper people, and what to do going into the rooms of very ill people. And I really respected her for that she acknowledged she couldn't just send any musician in just because they could play their instrument to a hospital room. So I've seen those kinds of projects, developed.
Over the 5 editions of the compendium, do you see certain developments that are maybe surprising or interesting to you?
I wouldn't want to speculate on that at the moment, but I would say that I do see that there's more and more projects in more and more countries. So the idea is growing. That music can be impactful.
Can play some role, yeah.
Yes, and it's important that it play a role, So I wish that was because of the compendium, which I'm not sure it is. But I do think that, I do see that there are more projects.
And let's look at the idea that maybe because of the compendium, the question is then, are people discovering certain practices? I guess I
would hear about it if they let me know, but I don't know. My hope is that people are discovering things they might do, which is why we have it in sections. The projects are in sections for what they can accomplish.
Yes.
And the sustainable development goals are addressed and how they're doing that. I think that you're seeing more and more openness in local governments and communities to these projects. But I still don't know where the funding is coming from. Because it has to be in my mind, to be sustainable, there has to be some combination between local funding and buy-in and the people that are doing it. Some people come from another country and come to a country and do a project. And that isn't always sustainable because that person goes home eventually. And it would be interesting to know what the changes have been. I think that there's more areas being covered, more types of problems being addressed. It's hard when you're gathering information about projects because there's there are many countries missing, from the compendium, and we're well aware of that, but we don't have any contacts with people in that country that are doing this work. We've grown in our ability to reach other kinds of countries. We as a network have found people who would like to be involved and who are doing projects. So we're finding more projects, but that isn't an indication of change necessarily. Just as being out there, you become well known enough that people would like to be in your compendium.
Yes.
And you hear about that. And I would like to see more countries addressed.
I imagine that Bridie Bartlett has told you about SIMM.
She has, indeed.
As she's our president, and what our interest is in helping to develop independent research on the place that music can have in social and community work. You with these...
Such a great goal.
Yes, but you with the view that you have over now having worked on these 5 editions of Compendia, what do you think are the most important needs in this field in terms of research?
As I say, I think that funders want program evaluation research.
Yes.
That seems to be what they want rather than what they call academic research. I met with a group of funders at Lincoln Center at one point, and that's what they told me. They don't want specific small questions asked about music and some of the academic types of research. They want to know more whether or not it's effective. That's really what they are looking to see in order, for their funding. For the field itself, I think we need to ask those specific questions. So I am personally not a researcher. So I don't have, I'm sure that you all and Bridie will have better solutions than I have, but there's so many questions to ask, so much research that could be done. But I think if it's coupled with the needs of the projects, which is to show that they're doing the work they say they're doing, which was your initial comment, I think that would be very helpful. But how realistic is it to take research into these projects, and how do you choose which projects to research? And, there are a lot of probably big questions you're asking yourselves. Who's going to do it?
Well, research is developing rapidly.
I mean, Bridie just did a research project, just completed a research project on one of our good projects that we've had for many years, Musicians Without Borders. And she just finished this research study. So they had a grant, and this was very helpful. So I'm sure there are researchers who would be willing to do a grant, to work if there was grants offered. Sadly, a lot of this comes down to fundraising, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Sadly.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
Yes. I feel like it's been a quick talk, but it's good to meet you.
Yes. Working on a 5th edition of Compendium Music as a Global Resource, one of the questions I had is how you can evaluate the presentations practitioners, facilitators of such programs make, and also in terms of how their projects have developed or are going to develop. So that's one question. And the second question, research is being mentioned and evaluation is being mentioned also in the book. And I would like you to tell us whether your impression is that this is taking an important place in this practice, the need for research.
Sure. Well, Lucas, I might begin by saying that having the opportunity to work alongside Professor Barbara Hesse on this latest edition of Music as a Global Resource as part of a Fulbright that I had in New York with her was an incredible opportunity to get a global view of this practice that is rapidly emerging around the world.
Yes.
What's unique about Music as a Global Resource is it brings together insights from 54 different countries. It's 109 projects, all viewed alongside one another. So often these projects...
From different areas, also urban and rural.
Absolutely. Urban, rural, musicians working in very different ways. Some programs run by music therapists, other community musicians, other music educators, and so on. And so often in these programs, we find they occur in isolation, very locally specific, without broader frameworks and references like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and also without broader reference to other programs across the world. So what we have in this compendium is that global overview. But I think we need to look at it for its purposes. Its purposes aren't necessarily to evaluate each individual program. There aren't the resources or the means to be able to do it. So it really relies on a lot of self-report from the organisations who are part of it. So I think that needs to be kept in mind when we're thinking about when we want to understand more deeply whether these programs are actually achieving their goals or aims. The purpose of the compendium isn't necessarily to evaluate these programs, but it's to bring them together, and it's to say, well, what kind of global overview do we have about music's contribution to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals when we see all of these programs side by side with one another. The other purpose was to use a program logic that's often used in international development to get each of the programs to talk specifically about their underpinning values and assumptions in the work, what their goals are, and what their observed outcomes are on a short to medium to long-term basis. So we asked questions that were framed around that program logic, and it was interesting to see how different programs responded. But at the end of the day, we weren't going out into the field and independently evaluating each of these programs. We had to rely on their own reflection of their own practice to report it.
Yes.
So I think it needs to be viewed with that in mind if we're talking about evaluation.
Yes, so the compendium gives us allows us to know what is where. It's a geography of social and community music work, and so this is very precious as such. And also the fact that it's that it can be reached, read online is something important also. And one of the questions that is being asked to the projects being presented in the compendium is the research and evaluation formats that they apply to their projects. And I would like you to give me an idea of do you get an idea of the place of independent research in the field, whether it's there, whether it's an important aspect already in the work, whether do we get an idea that this is growing? We do with SIMM, we get the idea that this is growing, but is the compendium also giving this information?
Yes, it is. And we ask a specific question where the programs identify whether they've had any research or evaluation undertaken in previous years, and they can share links to that. And so a number of the projects that we feature have had some degree of research built into them, but it is very ad hoc and it's very inconsistent, as you would imagine, across the world. Some have very highly systematic studies that have been done, particularly in the field of, say, music therapy, and then others have very, very minimal research. So I wouldn't say that there's any consistency across the world. It's actually quite ad hoc, as you might expect. I think many of these projects, because they have been sustained over a degree of time, do have a degree of monitoring as part of their everyday, operations. And I think that's probably because it's a requirement from funders.
Yes.
But the quality of the data and the quality of the critical thinking and reflection is potentially a little questionable. Whereas some of the more advanced, or shall we say mature projects that have been running over many years and developed their practice over many years have much more systematic research that has been undertaken by independent researchers who have worked with them. I think heard, though, time and time again, and Barbara has said this as well, the thing that programs are asking for the most is resources, but also research. They want researchers to work with them. They recognise the importance of research, not only in terms of advocating for the benefits that they might bring to communities in the work that they do, but I think they also want to learn how to do this work better, how to be more effective, how to be more critical, more ethical, and how to make sure that this work has great integrity and also develops artistically. And I think that's where critical research questions are really important. And these organisations recognise that that research is important to grow, but also to advocate for their importance to funders and justify their position. Now, whether this should actually occur with independent researchers or whether we should build capacity within organisations is actually quite an interesting question to debate. I know it's talked about a lot in terms of scholarly work around arts evaluation, for example. I think there are benefits to an independent researcher working with organisations because we might bring time, resources. I've worked on many of these before where grants are attached, so we can actually employ people to do the grunt work. Where you've got organisations who are very time poor, they're very busy, they want to put their energy into running their programs, not also running evaluation and research at the same time. So there are benefits. And I think also researchers with specialist expertise around particular social issues or ways of conducting research can really bring new insights to an organisation, and that's beneficial. But then I also am reluctant to be a researcher who just flies into a scenario as an outsider for a short period of time, makes all sorts of assessments and judgments, and then flies back out again. And I don't like that kind of research. It's not the kind of research I do. I prefer a much longer-term relationship-based engagement. And I'm interested in the role that these organisations can also play as co-researchers and as collaborators in the process, where they are part of data gathering. They are part of collective collaborative analysis and also co-authoring of outputs. I think that's a much more beneficial scenario.
It's also what we see, that many researchers in this field are themselves practitioners and
Indeed.
not necessarily doing research on their own practice, but possibly doing research on their own practice. And well accompanied, this can be a very meaningful format.
Absolutely.
I have another question, Bridie. Is it, I didn't go through in detail through the whole compendium, but I did see that also one of the elements of the information that is being requested from projects is the need they have for training, accompanying facilitators and practitioners, musicians or social workers. Can you give us your... Well, not necessarily a very detailed overview, but what are your impressions, at least, of the need in terms of training and accompaniment of the practitioners?
I think there is a very strong need for training of practitioners working in this space. And I think that there is a growing practice that's happening across the world.
Yes.
There's a growing interest. We know that there's an interest within communities and other sectors, but there's also an interest within the arts sector. There's an interest within higher music education, where people are recognising that this is a pathway for musicians to take, where they can make a very significant contribution towards communities. But it's highly specialised work. You do not just walk out of a conservatoire or whatever training you might have into a very complex scenario where there might be very complex needs with the community you're working with and know automatically what to do. There is a need for training in terms of the practice, but also how to look after yourself, how to look after the people that you're working with, and how to understand the complexity of the issues that you're dealing with. Now, this is an area where I think music therapists are possibly further advanced.
How come?
You've talked to Barbara Hesse, Barbara would talk at length about the rigours of music therapy training. And also the professional practice that then happens in the field, where music therapists have to remain accredited and they have to also comply with certain protocols and practices that not only keep them safe, but keep the people that they're working with safe, so that they actually know what they're doing and are not necessarily going to harm people by stirring up what music can stir up. I think in my home field of community music, we've had some organisations who are very established in the field who recognise this and support the community musicians who work with them and wrap a lot of support around them. But there's no other regulation, and you often see community musicians going into scenarios where people might be traumatised or whatever it might be, and it's very complex work that can have a challenging effect on those who they're working with, but also on themselves if they haven't got appropriate support to debrief or understand what's going on. And so I think there is a need for training, and there's a need across the world. I don't think the sorts of programs that are set up for this are widespread, but there's a growing interest. And so I think when you look at the very complex areas in which these music projects are happening across the compendium, there are some sections there that deal with people who are living with trauma and a raft of very complex issues. It really signals the need for musicians to know what they're doing in those scenarios. Now, I'm not saying that every musician needs to become a qualified therapist. Don't get me wrong. I think there's actually a role for musicians who aren't necessarily working as therapists, but working as highly skilled participatory musicians who are there creating work and creating collaborative, creative work, and bringing together a community for that purpose. And that's a whole different skill set. But I think there are still a number of ways in which we can prepare people for that work and also support people in the field when they're doing that work so that they're not suffering from vicarious trauma and all of those sorts of things that can happen if you don't know what you're doing and you're not well supported.
What has surprised you working on this compendium? What are the aspects of the work that you've been confronted with while working on this compendium that you did not necessarily expect to find?
I don't know if I would say this surprised me, but it really struck me.
Yes.
How significant music is in the daily lives of people and the power it can have to really enhance people and communities and societies' well-being in ways that we still do not understand and have a grasp of. I think what it really highlighted for me, if you think about the breadth of these programs and the context that they're occurring and the sorts of outcomes that are happening, you think, you know, what other amazing resource do we have as humans to do this kind of significant work? And so the breadth and the scale and the scope and all of those sorts of dimensions struck me. And this is as a seasoned researcher who's been doing this for decades and decades and decades. It really never ceases to amaze me how significant the impact of music can be. But having said that, what also struck me is how in a body like the United Nations working towards the Sustainable Development Goals, there is still not that recognition in a formal way about the role that music and the arts can be playing towards these big agendas. It's always a side issue. It's always something that might be championed by a couple of individuals, but it's never at the core of discussions. It's never part of core business. And that erasure of culture in that huge, big, important international discussion never ceases to amaze me. It just seems like such a missed opportunity that we've somehow got so wrong that it's not part of those big conversations if we're talking about addressing some of the most pressing issues facing humanity right now. And in all of this work that we did and documented, we saw how all of these programs were lighting up all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, yet it's still not a core part of the business of ECOSOC of the United Nations. I got to visit there a couple of times when I was in the UN. And this has been a project of Barbara's for decades with music as a global resource to try and put that on the agenda. And it gets some way, but it's never part of the core business. And I've realised that's because there aren't the proper mechanisms for that to happen. It just relies on a few champions and advocates, and that's a very precarious scenario. And so I still think there's a lot of work for all of us who are working at this global level of, connecting up all of these initiatives. And this is where SIMM can play a role alongside other big international organisations like the International Music Council and others to really be continuing to lobby for that recognition and understanding that this needs to be core in terms of addressing some of these incredibly important issues, from climate to equity to poverty and all of the other areas that the SDGs target.
Thank you very much, Bridie.
Thank you for having me again, Lucas.
Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM-podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simm-platform.eu.